How's everybody today? Yeah? GDC is always a good time. I'm Tom Cadwell. I work for Riot Games, and we're going to talk today a little bit about sort of the challenges of taking a really fun hardcore game and making it more accessible, and just sort of go through a case study of Riot Games' recent game, League of Legends, and how we got through that. But before we start, how many of you guys are actually League of Legends players? So, pretty good number. That's good. Glad somebody's playing it. We know a lot of people are, but so like I mentioned, it's really important to broaden your audience, especially as developing games grows more expensive. And a lot of titles have tried to do this. We obviously have done this with League of Legends, but some of the more famous examples would be World of Warcraft taking EverQuest, which was really hardcore, and making it way more accessible. Half-Life taking shooters, which were a lot more hardcore and broadening, and more recently Street Fighter 4 trying to smooth out some of the nuanced, hard-to-master mechanics and at least creating a perception that's easier to approach. So there's a couple challenges in doing this, though. The first is just that, a mechanic that is, hardcore, complex, and makes it hard for new players to get into the game is often something that experienced players in a multiplayer format have gotten really good at using and are good at crushing people with. So, you're taking it away, and you're kind of taking the wind out of the sails of people who are used to winning all the time. Another is just that if you have a really complicated feature that people have mastered that's kind of standard to the genre, in removing it, you're actually taking your existing fan base and making them relearn the genre. So, example, this would be Command and Conquer. Dune had a particular left-click, right-click standard, which got flipped in the Blizzard games, and I have to imagine that, if you went from, Command and Conquer or Dune and went to a Blizzard RTS, like initially that's kind of jarring. I remember going through that myself. So the more of these you add, the more, you're giving a game to hardcore users that just feels alien and like something they really have to learn again, and that reduces how well you can get them into your game. So there's a couple ways to solve this. And, really, this is all about trade-offs. There's really no silver bullet. It's really just a series of choices that mitigate your loss of hardcore users and keep them involved to the point where they're then excited about your innovations. The first is just that if you're going to remove something, it's really important that you fully understand what benefit is giving you. And we ran into this a lot in League of Legends. I'll get to that in a little bit. But just because a mechanic seems really bad or really unfun or just kludgy doesn't mean that the overall game isn't benefiting in some way at the same time. And we underestimated that a few times, and I think it's really important to scrutinize those carefully before shooting them in the head. Another is UI. That's one of the first points the user touches when they come into the game, so it's going to immediately confront them with a learning curve. So if you're going to change the UI, it really needs to be high value because the experts are going to notice, and they're going to notice a lot, and new players still may go up the hill on a less optimal but still pretty good UI. And I'll give you more examples, but a great one was just that we flipped the side the mini-map was on in our game, and for really not a great reason, and that wasn't a good decision. So, it's small things like that. You shouldn't do them unless it's really key. And lastly, especially with multiplayer games where you're going to have a vibrant, engaged community, we found it very effective to just explain why we were making changes. And even if hardcore users didn't completely agree, just explaining to them what we thought meant that some of them would agree and then would evangelize effectively for us and explain to people they're playing with when they see like, oh, this sucks, or something along that lines. They'd say, well, no, actually, there's a good reason why that's here, and you should be happy about it. And people doing that really smoothed out a lot of tough times for us. So League of Legends, as I mentioned, is our first game at Riot Games, and it's heavily based on Dota, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And Dota is a Warcraft 3 mod that is extremely popular worldwide. I think there's tens of millions of downloads of new versions when they come out. But it's also amongst hardcore competitive multiplayer games, one of the most complex, adversarial, and hard to learn of all the games. I mean, Counter-Strike may be hard to get into if you don't have shooter experience, but it's pretty straightforward. There's a limited number of guns, and things play a certain way, and you don't have to learn a library list of nuances. Whereas with Dota, it really is that way. It's very inaccessible. So a little bit more about Dota. So our challenge, of course, was to preserve that deep gameplay of Dota while making it accessible to a broader community. So we call this genre the MOBA genre. Some people call it action strategy or RTS. And essentially, what it is you play a single character rather than a group of units. And each character you play has a bunch of unique abilities that do cool things, kind of like a hero in Warcraft 3 if you're familiar. And through the course of a game session, which is about an hour, you progress kind of like an RPG, leveling and gaining items and stuff, both by defeating in-game monsters and other players, and then with the eventual goal of stomping your opponents and being famous, or at least being able to talk trash. The problem, though, is that Dota has a lot of team hate, and you probably know this guy. Looks kind of like me in a bad mood, I guess. And basically, Dota has a bunch of mechanics that heavily encourage players to get really angry at their team members. And we thought that was a big problem because, maybe some of you know people who have played Dota and, they get online and they get yelled at by their teammates and they say, I don't really like this game. I think I'm going to go back to, WoW or, Counter-Strike or any number of other games that's less adversarial. So the reason this is the case in Dota, there's a couple reasons. The first is just that if you die, you're leveling up your opponents and feeding them gold. So not only does your playing poorly make you not win the game, it actually makes your allies lose the game, which makes them not like you. Secondly, rewards are given when player-on-player combat occurs by having the last damaging strike on a player. So, if me and my friend are fighting a guy and I do most of the damage and then he swoops in at the last minute with a spell, he gets all the reward in Dota. And that causes a lot of angst in team members too, because people, accuse each other of kill stealing, and that becomes a, he said, she said kind of argument on the team that's just not very fun for anybody. Another problem is just that you can cause friendly fire in a few cases in Dota. You can, grab your allies out of a kill or into a tower. You can, some abilities potentially can cause dangerous situations for them. And obviously that makes people pretty angry because it's much harder to avoid than in a shooter sometimes. And lastly, this is a little bit more subtle, but in Dota, it's balanced in a way where certain character types are intended to be kind of game closers. So if those particular characters, the physical DPS characters, are able to get a lot of kills on someone, they ensure a win. So if you specifically die to one of those characters, you make your team members extra angry. So we had a number of fixes we rolled out to try to mitigate these problems. The first of which was diminishing returns for killing a player. So, and this is manifested in a bunch of different systems. I won't get into too much detail, but in general, if you've died a lot, you're worth less. And that discourages, it makes you feeding, less of a big deal to your team, and it also makes repeated killing of one player less prominent. Another is just that we added assist reward for kills that are pretty significant, so that if we're, Bob and I are trying to kill somebody and he, steals the killing blow, I still get a big reward, so I don't care as much. Additionally, We reduced the amount of abilities that could do friendly fire. I think there's like maybe 2 in the game right now that can friendly fire in some kind of vague way. I think one of them is a wall that just makes an impassable barrier, so you can hurt somebody with that, but in general you can't do unfriendly things to your team members in League of Legends. And we also try to make all champions good in the late game, as opposed to Dota, which has the one character type that's intended to snowball and win. And that's important because it means that not only can your entire team be successful now, carry you forward, it also means that you're not causing rage when you die to the other team's kind of snowball character. So this went pretty well. So we got some feedback from our community. The first thing was that players loved that they could get assist rewards, and they loved that casters got better throughout the game as opposed to some specific characters intended to be late game powerhouses. So that was universally supported with rare exceptions. However, this was something that really caught us by surprise, and I think it's really subtle and important. Is that because we evened out a lot of these cases, we made it much harder for one person to become the powerhouse that carried the game. And those really memorable, emotional highs of, I played this game and I went 30 kills and 0 deaths, that really makes the genre actually pretty sticky. And a similar case would be, TF2 or any shooter. We all remember the game where, we were on a server and, we went, 50 kills and 2 deaths or whatever. And even a bad player can have this happen sometimes. And those emotional highs really imprint on people, and they remember them and think fondly of the game for them, and will actually take a lot of punishment from the game, even if, so long as, they're getting those kinds of moments. So we ended up kind of taking those out of the game with our changes, which was not good. And of course, predictably, some hardcore users, said, hey, this game's too easy, and it's not for me, and we kind of ignored that because I think a little bit of that's going to happen if you're going to broaden the game. If the game's still fun and it's largely familiar, I think you can still be successful. It's a puzzle. So in response to those changes, we changed a few things, kind of learning from what happened. So the first thing we did was we tried to focus rewards to re-enable the super carry scenario, where one player can sometimes carry the game. And we did that both by adjusting the individual rewards to be a little bit more weighty, as well as to add some specific items where you could potentially become very powerful if you had a string of great success. Additionally, we tried to add more champions that are just really hard to play super well. Not to the point where it's just impossible or that they're badly designed, but just that it takes a lot longer to master them. And we try to balance them to be just incrementally better than some of the easier champions. But that being said, if you look at our top tier champions right now, a good number of them are pretty easy to do. And lastly, this is a big mistake we made. We tried to add a death penalty because in Dota, part of what causes the snowballing is when you die, you lose a lot of gold as well as time. So we added a slight gold penalty. But this actually hurt the gameplay a lot. And kind of the takeaway I'd like to leave you with on this topic is that if you can enable individual snowballing, that's really good because it creates high emotional points that people remember. But if you create team snowballing, you're just creating a miserable experience for 5 players in your 10-player game every game. Oh, sorry. Forgot about that. Usually not on a microphone. So anyway, I think it's really important when you tune a team-based game to avoid things that cause team snowballing and just to focus on individual snowballing. And I think we were largely successful with that in League of Legends in the end. So controls and UI are another area we tried to broaden the genre. And this was a little bit more of a mixed bag than the team hate, which I think we hit pretty well. And the basic problem is, Warcraft 3, which is what Dota's modded in, is a game about multiple unit selection. You have groups of 12, or you might have even an army of 30 or 40 units potentially. Not usually, but potentially. And the controls are built for that. They're really effective at doing that. But Dota, as well as League of Legends, are one character games for the most part, where you're just controlling one unit all the time. So you can see here on the right side of League of Legends, very few entities that are characters on the screen. Left side you have War 3, where players attacking a base with a lot of units. So a couple specific problems I just want to call out. First is that the Warcraft 3 minimap is designed to show a lot of unit information at equal importance, whereas in Dota and League of Legends, champions or heroes are what matter, and the other stuff's kind of a little more ancillary. Additionally, in Warcraft 3, you can deselect your hero. So you're controlling your hero, and you click somewhere, and now you're not in control of your character, and it feels terrible. But it makes sense in Warcraft 3 because you're controlling a ton of units. Additionally, in Warcraft 3, because you're managing a lot of units, crowd control effects are blocking input. So, if I get stunned, it makes sense that my unit's not going to continue doing what it's doing because the situation's changed a lot, potentially in the time he's crowd controlled. Not as good when your entire focus is one character. Small nitpick, hotkeys don't follow a logic that is super optimized for more of an action-oriented single-character game. And there's also a bunch of supporting UI to enable multi-unit control. So it's a little bit dry, but there's some interesting points that happen here. So minimap is the area where I think we made the best improvements. So first thing we did is we moved the minimap to the lower right for map flow reasons. This ended up not being a great idea. It wasn't for a good reason. On the other hand, heroes are really hard to spot in Dota because they're just big dots. We replaced them with portraits in League of Legends. So just a comparison. On the left, that's Warcraft 3 Dota. It's really hard to see what's going on here. And then compare it to League of Legends, where you can see specific character portraits, and if you play the game, those are pretty intelligible if you've seen the hero before. So we got some results from this. Most players like the new minimap. No surprise. It's what we expected. It was a good innovation. But, and this is another subtle thing that we found surprising, we don't find it surprising now, we found it surprising then, is that if someone had already spent several thousand hours playing Dota, their eye had trained to actually read that minimap really, really well. Like they could glance at it and just tell you exactly what was going on the map. So people actually had to relearn the minimap switching to League of Legends, which for a really hardcore player was a learning curve. But we thought it was a good exchange because the net benefit was just so large. And lastly, this is where we think we made an error, was people kind of subtly didn't like the minimap being on a different side. And I think when people are playing a game, there's just a collection of things that make them feel at home or not, and every little bit makes them less likely to stick with your game. And swapping the minimap side, their muscle memory was trained to move their mouse to the lower left in Dota, and now it's going lower right, and it's really small, but it all adds up, and we think it was a mistake, and we're actually going to revert that decision sometime soon and add an option. A couple other minor things we did. We made it impossible to deselect your champion, which was largely successful. And we allowed crowd-controlled characters, stuns and so forth, to actually issue orders and queue them for after being uncrowd-controlled. We also remapped hotkeys to a more logical place of the keyboard. And we also remapped attack and stop to some new lull features, which are spells you can bring into the game for any hero. And lastly, we got rid of F1 and 1, which are commonly used for hero selection in Warcraft 3. So the results of that. So for the most part, players liked the no deselect and order queuing and that sort of thing because it wasn't something removed from the game. It was just an annoyance that people had to deal with that had no value that we removed. So that was without question, appreciated. But people did miss multi-unit selection because we couldn't do pet characters effectively, and we're going to look into doing a revision on that soon. But the biggest mistake we made actually was A and S, because for those of you who play RTSs, which is, I assume, most of the audience, A and S are important hotkeys in RTS. A is attack, S is stop. The attack key is a lot more important in Dota than it is in League of Legends, but people expect that A does something because it's such a central key. So people are coming into League of Legends, pressing A, wasting their summoner spell, and being, where's my attack key? And they couldn't find it because it was on X. And this was just a big mistake, and I think it goes back to my point of don't change the default UI unless you're getting an enormous amount of benefit out of it. And moving forward, what we did is we actually reverted this change, leaving users who already had the game installed with our new improved hotkeys, and then making future installs default to ANS. So, yeah. Additionally, people like the new mnemonic keys for QWER for the abilities because they're new characters. They didn't have expectations of what the abilities would be. And it also turned out that was the preferred hotkeys for people that took the time to remap anyway. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 worked for items because no one was using control groups in Dota really. And some veterans did miss F1 for hero select, so we went ahead and added it back in. We hadn't really removed it for any reason. We just thought, well, if you're always selected, it doesn't matter. Turns out it wouldn't have hurt to leave it in. I mean, it didn't hurt the game by being there. We just were cleaning up the UI, and so. So another major issue we had to deal with in League of Legends was just this concept of juking. And juking is an evasion method where in Warcraft 3 Dota, if you go around a tree, you can disrupt line of sight and cancel your opponent's orders. So if I'm trying to cast a spell and I'm running after you, and then you duck around a tree, I'll just stop. And really advanced players could use that to basically prevent people from casting spells at them and attacking and so forth. It's a very advanced mechanic. It also allows you to escape. And both of those are really important in Dota. And we really underestimated how important they were. So just a little more information. If you look at this picture here, you can see that's actually a path through the trees. Very hard to spot. And that's actually a lot of why we didn't like it, because it's just so hard to see what's going on. So we added a couple fixes to juking. First of all, we tried to make it more obvious paths so larger pieces of terrain could facilitate juking. Because we felt that the Dota, version was just really, really hard to make sense of. And we had a couple places we used in our map, but we also added some other escape mechanics because we thought, well, juking is pretty important. We should make sure that there are some escape mechanics, otherwise it probably won't be the same game. But they were a lot simpler and easier to master. And we also tweaked orders with Fog of War, where we didn't just drop your order when someone went around a fog. And that goes back to War 3, which had a different set of criteria for unit control. So we felt like that would feel better and more responsive. It just felt kind of kludgy and weird to us where, I'm right-clicking to go somewhere, and I'm focusing on it, and then I just stop for, a quarter of a second until my order can queue up again. So this wasn't as successful. Straight up removing it and adding kind of incremental replacements was not great because it took a lot of the skill differentiation out of the game. Sorry, one last point about that. Players had far fewer tools to escape. In an outclass situation, you pretty much die or escape. Whereas in Dota, if you're really, really good, you can make these, by the skin of your teeth escapes that feel really memorable and really good. And kind of go back to my point about emotional highs. Making a great escape makes you feel really good about the game for a while. And in removing juking, we pretty much killed that, which made the game less interesting to a lot of people. So we made some changes. First, we added the brush mechanic, which is kind of like Wall of Grass in StarCraft 2, except it's more like an interrogation room mirror where you can see out of the brush if you're in it, but people can't see into it. So you can hide in the brush, or you can cut through it to cut off people's line of sight and escape, or double back on top of them. There's a lot of things you can do with it, and people generally like this. We also sped up fog of war updating, so it was a little bit easier to shake someone if you were doing a rapid maneuver through brush or terrain. And we also added additional hero types, usually with teleports, that could do some advanced manipulations of line of sight and brush in ways that were significantly skill differentiated. And lastly, we added some items that facilitated more nuanced escape, and summoner spells as well. So one of which was Flash, which could actually disable a spell coming at you if you timed it just right. So the last major problem we had to confront in League of Legends was denial. And denial is essentially killing your own allies, not other players, but other units. So if a tower or minion is weak, you can stab it in the back, basically, and deny your opponents or reduced rewards for killing the unit. And this is actually really important in Dota, and this is a case where we kind of underestimated, again, how important it was. We just thought, hey, we don't like denying, we can keep the game interesting. But the two purposes it really served were, first, it allowed you to control how close to a defendable location you work, because if your army's advancing and you slow down its advance, then you'll be closer to your home base or your tower. The other aspect of it is it just, even though it's kind of a dumb mechanic, it's still an action you can perform to do better than the other guy. So if you're denying it and killing stuff, you're doing better than a person who's not denying. And, bad skill differentiation in the hands of expert players is still skill differentiation. So here's kind of our thoughts on deny. Not a fan. So specifically, we think it's counterintuitive and weird. Killing your own guys just kind of breaks convention. It's also, from sort of a broad gameplay perspective, something that pushes the game into really a defensive mode in the first 10, 15 minutes in Dota, because you just stay close to your tower if you're good, and people can't really do much to you. It's also not that fun. I mean, it's skill differentiating, and you feel good when you do it, but it's just not fun in the same way casting a spell is, or getting a bunch of gold from killing something is. It's just not super fun. And, for those reasons, we wanted to kill it. So we removed it. And we were a little aware. We were aware there would be some downsides. So we tried to increase the amount of other actions players were performing in the early game. First, by providing more creatures to kill, so you had to worry about that more, as well as rebalancing spells and abilities so that you use them a lot in League of Legends. In Dota, you usually only get a couple casts of your early abilities. And abilities are like one of the coolest parts of the game, we thought. So, if you're casting a fireball every 10 seconds, that's a lot more fun than every 30. And that's what we tried. And of course, just to help get away from the defensive gameplay, we added more reasons for players to work together early on, both in terms of NPC objectives and adding greater rewards for things that take teams to do. So here's the result. We had people with pitchforks at our gates. The hardcore community was not happy about it. And generally what we saw is people would either come in and be kind of surprised or unhappy about it and stick with the game, or be surprised and happy and quit. We lost a lot of users by making this decision. In the long run, we think it was the right decision, but it definitely cost us hardcore users. And I think when you broaden a game, you're often going to run into scenarios where, you make a trade and you make your best guess you can, and hopefully it nets you users. Expert players in general felt there was less skill differentiating opportunities in the early game. Over time that changed, though, interestingly, because a lot of the mechanics we added had to be mastered to become skill differentiating. But the initial response, especially earlier in our beta, was more negative from ultra pro players, whereas now a good number of them dual play, our game and similar games. And of course, we made some steps in rebalancing early incentives, but this actually disrupted some of the later incentives in the game, and we had to iterate a bunch to get them so that different options in the gameplay were roughly as enticing to players. So in response, we explained why we did it. This actually was really, really effective because selling it to players is something they're gaining, namely aggressive early play, more team incentives. A lot of players heard that and were like, hey, that sounds like a pretty good idea, and then would convey that message to their friends who were a little bit more hesitant. We also continued to just do tuning and balancing to try to make more exciting things happen throughout the game. Some more tuning we also did, just added more incentives to further, push interesting gameplay happening. And in the end, we think it worked out. But, again, it cost us users. We may never get them back. And anytime you do a decision like this, that's how it's going to be. And you have to be really careful. So, I have some closing thoughts. I think if we did this all over again, we'd be a lot more careful with the big systems, and we just would not change certain things like the side the mini-map's on and the A&S attack keys, which just didn't help us at all. We also find that with an established user base who likes the game, you can take a lot bigger risks. I mean, we could add a new game mode tomorrow that had additional features changed, and we'd get a free pass from existing users. So kind of the corollary to that is if your default mode of access for hardcore players feels like what they're looking for, you're going to get less drop-off. So it's possible to do a little bit of eating your cake and having it too. I think single player is a good mechanism for kind of doing a gradual entry. You can also go with multiple game modes. There are risks there. And with League of Legends, we're actually doing some of this. We're adding some new map types that play very differently but leverage a lot of the same gameplay, and we're confident that our hardcore users will give these a chance because they like your game in general, and they're not having as much of a they're already invested in the product basically. So additionally, just kind of wondering out loud, can you sidestep with a classic mode, or is it dangerous? On the other hand, some players or some designers do say, hey, just give players options, let them choose. Dangerous part of that is then the users choose what gameplay mode is dominant, which may or may not be the most fun and sticky one. It may just be the most familiar one. Or you could also do an example of this is, StarCraft 2 is making, in my opinion, a really, really broad single-player campaign that I think is going to be great while being more true to multiplayer. That's another way you can go if you want to broaden the audience. So at this point, I'll open it up to questions. Oh. Well, you can look at my girlfriend had my laptop for a while, so.
Hi. Could you just talk a little bit about how you think League of Legends community is different from the Dota community now?
So you asked what are the differences between the League of Legends community and the Dota community. Sure. So I think in general the League of Legends community is less adversarial. It's still hardcore, but it's a good deal friendlier. And we had that happen from two major ways. One is just the mechanics are less punishing, so there's less anger in general. The other is, as we were growing our community, we were very careful to be extremely involved early and push out people who are really adversarial and encourage good behavior so that the kind of the mood of the room, the cultural etiquette you feel when you come into the game is more friendly.
I don't know how much you can talk about this, but when are you going to implement some type of draft mode?
Sorry, when we're going to implement
draft mode?
Oh, draft
I don't know how
mode.
much you can talk about that. But.
Sure. I don't have a specific date. We're planning on rolling that into our season 1 launch, which we're working really hard on right now. The question was when we'll have draft mode. Sorry.
Hi. In your talk, I feel that there's a lot of difference to hardcore players.
Yes.
I just wonder what is the definition of a hardcore player and what is the size of that group in the ratio of hardcore player compared to the general community. Because
sure.
I consider myself an average player, but I love the game. I have spent a lot of money on it, and
thank you.
And I just wonder whether it's more important to cater for the hardcore community or the average community, because I love all the changes, the brushes and the removal of denying. I just feel that I play both.
You were a Dota player or not a Dota player?
I did.
Okay.
For a while.
Okay. So your question was essentially how do you even define a hardcore player? And would I define someone who plays a lot necessarily as a hardcore player? I would define a hardcore player as someone that obviously plays a lot and appreciates a lot of the more arcane nuances of the game at a fairly committed level. They're often aspirational towards competitive play, and they're usually very vocal online. So it's the guys who played Dota 2,000 hours but never posted online and played it on a LAN with their friends generally weren't hardcore Dota players. It's more the people that are setting opinions on forums and trying to go to tournaments, and those guys are very loud and they're very influential. So I think it's sort of the elite and the aspiring elite players, not 100%, but like 80% of them maybe. And in terms of what you go after, I think it's really a business decision, and it has to do with how much growth you think there can be. If you think the game is broadly appealing, and you think that by being more broadly appealing, you're going to get a lot of new customers, you would try to do it. Whereas if it's a really established genre like a shooter, you might take less of those risks. I think it just depends on, where you think you could get. With Dota, we felt it was so hardcore, but so fun at the same time that there was going to be a big opportunity around it, because we knew, hardcore players in other genres, like guys who love, WoW arenas or guys who played a lot of RTSs or, play Counter-Strike would come to Dota and sometimes have a really bad time. So that to us suggested that there's probably a lot of users who didn't like those super hardcore mechanics and would enjoy the game if it was less punishing.
So just on a side question, so what do you think is the ratio of hardcore player versus the...
It just depends. So your question was, what's the ratio of hardcore to casual players or mid-core players? It just depends what you're talking about, and it's going to depend on the genre and the type of game. Next question.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. So I wanted to know how many users you guys have right now as compared to Dota, and with the microtransaction model, it's always hard to balance the game.
Sure.
If you're giving items which people can buy, and so how do you guys go about
Sure. So your question was first how many users we have, and the other was how do you balance microtrans into a hardcore competitive game. So I can't give you the precise number of users today, but we did put out a press release recently that we had surpassed 1 million registered users. So we're very happy with how the game's going so far. It's only been out for, 4 months, I guess now. As for the microtrans, we were very careful about that, and our strategy was, because a perception of competitiveness is so key to the game succeeding, and actual competitiveness is even more key in some ways, we worked really hard to make sure that anything that you could buy that gave you a significant advantage, or really even any advantage at all, is something that you could also earn through playing the game. And we also, specifically with regards to champions, which are a lot of what we sell, made sure that a lot of the really inexpensive ones and free ones are equivalent in power to some of the most nuanced, hardcore, expensive, not widely available champions. So I think, and I think we've been pretty successful with that. I mean, we had a lot of concern when the game first came out, but we don't really hear it that much now from people who actually play the game. Seldom at all, actually.
Okay, I was wondering what your thoughts were on the practice of smurfing. Is that something
right.
you see as a problem?
Sure. Yeah, so your question was what I think of smurfing. I think smurfing, for those of you who don't know, is when a really good player makes a new account for the purpose of beating up a bunch of new players. Because that's really gratifying, right? Like, I mean, going 10 runs in a row is really fun. So we think it's a big problem. We don't have a big problem within League of Legends, though, for two reasons. One is just that because you're acquiring unlocks and leveling yourself up in League of Legends over time outside of the game, people have less incentive to do that because if they're smurfing, they're not progressing their main account. The second thing is that we actually in our matchmaking system do a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff to spot people who appear to be super pro and get them away from newbies quickly. So.
I was curious, when you were thinking about ways to broaden the scope and make it easier, maybe for more casual gamers, was there also a lot of thought put towards art style changes or even like story changes or non-gameplay mechanic changes?
Yeah, so your question was, where do we think about broadening the appeal of the game beyond, just gameplay? Did we think about art and story? I think to an extent we did. I certainly think that the more you polish a game in general, the more everybody's going to just try to like it. If you come into the game and the presentation's great, you put up with more, right? I think we actually kind of did adjust our art style a little bit. We went sort of a little bit cartoony, highly stylized look. And then we found through the beta that our users tended to latch on average, a little bit more to the kind of more evil-looking characters. And while we still are going to continue to make all sorts of characters, we did, recalibrate to make a little bit more kind of, angsty hardcore characters. And that's because the people we were grabbing were not casual gamers. They were gamers who previously had bounced off of Dota or play other, pretty hardcore games. That's where a good portion of our users came from. And their biases go that direction.
As it pertains to like balance and collecting data, in terms of like who's winning on what maps and stuff, do you separate that data based on player skill level since you have that? You have like the elo numbers of players. Do you get separate balance numbers for new players versus bad players?
Okay, so your question was, do we slice up our data to, is it balanced differently or just analyzed differently?
Both.
Okay. So do we slice up our data to balance the game differently for different strata of players or to tune differently? We do look a little bit about that kind of stuff, but we don't actually make different balance decisions. Our philosophy generally is, though, if a particular game mechanic or character is making the game not fun at a particular skill level, we need to make an adjustment. So, we're willing to have something be underpowered for competitive play if it was wrecking, mid-tier play. And there are definitely differences. I mean, if, something like Cryo Phoenix, who's, really hard to use correctly, is quite successful at high play, but is terrible at mid-tier play.
In Dota, there's a lot of items and item recipes. How did you handle that in League of Legends?
Well, that's a good question. So you asked, how did we handle the item recipe system in Dota? I thought about it, including them in the talk, actually. So in Dota, they have this complicated system where you buy items and then you buy a recipe scroll, and then it auto-upgrades into the higher tier item. And we just integrated that into the shop UI just because we thought it would be more intuitive and you wouldn't lose any gameplay. Interestingly, some players did hate it, which we thought was bizarre, but it was a really narrow minority. Most players much preferred our shop.
When you add pet classes or possibly clone classes or heroes, are you guys going to change the interface? And if you are, because I think right now or for a while you were using Alt to control your pet, correct? So
yeah, it's pretty kludgy.
If you use one button to control it, does that mean that we're going to be limited to just pet classes with one pet? Like, are we going to have anybody with like 3 or 4 clones?
Sure. So your question was, how do we plan on supporting pet classes? We're actually having the UI team do some research on it right now. We probably won't go with an RTS multi-select. We'll probably do a hotkey and kind of select button-based method where you can select, So the short answer is we'll find a solution that allows multiple pets as long as we can do it elegantly and we think we can. But we're doing some R&D on that right now.
So there would be no way to, you guys aren't going to change it back to the 1, 2, 3 setup?
I don't think we're going to use the War 3 setup now.
Okay, thanks.
But I promise it'll be good.
I actually have a couple of questions.
Oh, okay.
How has the differences between the 5v5 style of gameplay and the 3v3 changed the concept of team hate?
Let's see. So you asked if the team hate issues are different on 3-on-3 and 5-on-5. So we think the 3-on-3 mode is potentially a little bit more competitive because small errors by one player are more likely to cost you a game, which is also why 5-on-5 was our original mode, because when there's a larger number of players, you're less able to cost your team the game. So I think that 3-on-3 probably will have a little bit more team hate naturally because it's more possible for one poor player to sink the team. But we can get around that by just funneling people into the less team hatey mode first, which I think is a generally good principle if you're taking in new users.
My second question is, so with the case study of League of Legends, we've been focusing on player versus player, and skill differentiation was a big part of broadening the genre.
Right.
How would you apply that same concept to a strictly single-player game, player versus enemy?
Sure. So your question was, how would you broaden on a more purely single-player game, where versus League of Legends, which is multiplayer and really based on skill differentiation? I think there's a couple ways you can do it. One old trick is you just straight up, with controls and things like that, recommend people into one way and give them the option to go the other in an obvious place. You can also do a lot of, I think like, as long as the core mechanics in single player is always an unwinding, right? Like you don't put all mechanics on someone immediately in a single player game. You gradually introduce them. I think you get a little more latitude because as long as the overall game experience is similar, I think you get a lot more latitude in specific mechanics if the game feels awesome otherwise. I just don't. I think a lot of the best broadening in single player games I've seen is usually just doing a better job of articulating hardcore mechanics. And I haven't seen a lot of like, oh, I hate this first-person shooter single player because I can't rocket jump. I think the expectations are a little bit different. They're less harsh, and people expect a learning curve anyway throughout the game. So sorry, it's not the best answer for either, but
it works.
Yeah. Any other questions or? Okay. Well, thank you guys. Oh, one more. Okay.
Most importantly, are you guys hiring?
What's that?
Are you guys hiring?
Yes. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to plug. So you asked if we're hiring. So we're hiring a lot of positions. They're on our website, most especially all types of programmers. And I personally really need a technical designer, which is a designer who can write code. It's a pretty cool role. You actually do get C++ access, unlike most places. It's pretty cool. Let me know if you're interested. So great. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for coming, and I hope you found it helpful.